So, before today's ship chat, I'd like to extend a small apology to Harper Steele. You see, Harper is the man that introduced me to the Kamarag, a ship which has since become my favourite and the Romulans' favourite punching bag. And so this video is basically my apology to him, because it's his favourite ship in STO. I'm sorry, Harper, but also I'm not sorry. Anyway, today's ship chat, we're going to be taking a look at the Kamarag. And I'm going to give it a fair shake. We're going to look at it in depth and in context and really decide, is it really as bad as I have said? Spoilers, yes, but also no. We'll get into it. Okay, so in terms of the behind-the-scenes story, it was designed for STO. Apparently, it was a very early STO ship, which is surprising because the textures on it are very nice for an old ship. Works very well, especially those when you do it in the early TNG era colors with that sort of aqua green. Looks very good. I've referenced it several times in my videos and given it quite a harsh accounting. It's also, and an interesting thing is that it was designed by STO as a Lost era ship, which is quite interesting. It also apparently has undergone some scaling shifts. Originally, it was scaled at about 360 meters, which is a good place. But they apparently recently scaled it up to be similar size to the Vocha, which I don't like so much, because then you then run into the question of, well, then why not just have a Vocha or whatever? You know, it takes away some of the individuality of the Kamarag, and I think putting it at 300 odd meters, but essentially scaling it around 300 meters, that puts it kind of in its own unique category, which is nice. Anyway, so we'll get into the in-universe story of the Kamarag, and perhaps we'll understand why it is the way it is. So the first thing to understand is the design process behind Kamarag. So after the Khitmor Accords, for 20 years the Klingons were forbidden to build any new battlecruisers. For 20 years. This was so that they could devote necessary funding towards the rebuilding of their homeworld and, staving off ecological catastrophe. So, there's that. 20 years hence, okay, boys, you can build a new ship. Trouble is, all the shipwrights that you had got together to build the D7s and Ktingas, with Klingon ship construction, or ship design, it's carried out by guilds. So basically, a group of guys gets together and say, we're going to build this kind of ship. We're going to build a raptor. We're going to build a bird of prey. And over the years, obviously, they incorporate new people retire and new people enter their ranks. And these are the guilds. And basically, the idea is that they're continually pumping out. It's a very Klingon approach. The idea for the Klingons is then they're never going to need anything new. They're just going to build off of previous archetypes. So that's why you get the guild of the battle cruiser, which designed everything from D4 all the way up to D7 and Ktinga, so on and so forth. And they'll constantly be churning out new designs and new variants and so on and so forth. There's a little bit of rivalry, but basically, people are kind of specialized towards one style of building over another. So you had a lot of those guys retire in those 20 years. So basically, when they come to building the Kamarag, they try and get some of those guys out of retirement, try and coax them back. They also try and get some new blood into the mix, but it's all there's not been that connective tissue in between. Normally, these guilds are constantly pumping out new variants, new updates, new marks of the same design, constantly adding to and improving the design, and that kind of keeps things ticking over and keeps new ideas ticking over. But that hasn't been happening for 20 years. So they're a little bit out of practice. There's also another problem. The ship had a lot of cost limitations placed around it. The Klingon High Council wanted the Kamarag cheap, because they really did not have much money around at the time. So basically, when it came to designing the Kamarag, the last ship that was on the drawing board that they had plans for was D8, which was, back in the 90s. So that's the concept that they're working off. But they also incorporate a lot of new technologies and new systems. Most clearly, they made use of buzzards. This would improve the economics of the ship. It would make it much cheaper to run because it would be taking in fuel, would improve supply, logistics, stuff like that. It was a very good way to run a more economical fleet. And it was also intended to be less maintenance intensive. Again, you're running on lower manpower. You want these ships to have higher level readiness. The goal of the design was to challenge the Excelsior and the Nova class. Unfortunately, at the point that they were designing to beat those ships, the Federation and the Romulans were already building Vamalak and Ambassador, which therefore makes the whole thing a little bit irrelevant. But the Klingons didn't know that, and didn't really have a hope in hell of matching those. What we ultimately get in the finished product is half old and half new. There's a lot of D7 DNA in there, but there's equally a lot of stuff that we'll see in the Watcher, not just structurally, although you do see some interesting structural changes that we will get to, but also under the hood as well. There's some interesting changes. So in terms of innovation, they've moved the join for the command section from the start of the boom, where it was in the Ktinga, up to the head. So just after the head, that's where it separates, which implies that the Kamarag has a degree of modularity at play as well, that you can actually change out for different modules. Whether they actually did, I'm not sure. It doesn't look like they ever bothered coming up with new modules, but it's interesting to see that they were already working on that idea. They also changed the command hull quite substantially. It's a less of a target than before. You don't have such an obvious bridge and bridge tower superstructure. It's much more blended into that upper superstructure. I mean, obviously that's still where the bridge is, but it's a little bit lower profile. You don't have that big sensor tower sticking out the top. You also have, as well as there not being a sensor tower, you also have an interesting change as well, which is that there is now an auxiliary bridge on the neck. That's basically that little elevated section there. So essentially a secondary command deck in there, which is interesting. The move to redundancy, whereas before on Klingon ships, things were very centralized and things were very much oriented towards that command section, that command unit at the front, at the very prow of the ship. And if that went, it was basically game over. Here, the Kamarag, it can be decapitated, for want of a better term, and it can still fight. They also installed new torpedo and disruptor systems. With the torpedoes, because you have a larger hull, they're able to use a newer, larger kind of torpedo launcher, that being a burst fire torpedo launcher. Now, the way this works, I did check the size of the torpedo aperture itself, and you can only actually get one torpedo out at a time. But the burst fire works by basically having a longer tube into which you can preload 3 torpedoes, and then it goes 1, 2, 3. Fires them basically in a linear motion, one after the other. Now, there are limitations to this. Initially, the torpedoes could only be targeted at the same ship. They couldn't fly off in different directions. Though eventually that was changed, but the preference was still to fire your volley of 3 at the same target because it's more effective. Frankly, 1 torpedo each at multiple targets isn't going to be that effective on most ships. The other innovation was the disruptors, and that is that the disruptors are now dual mode. They are capable of firing in both beams, like we see in Next Generation, and impulses, which gives them a lot of versatility. You can use them now very effectively up close, but you can actually now poke with them out at further ranges. You're not solely reliant on your torpedo armament, which is good because the Klingons want to save that ammunition. They're not swimming in torpedoes like they once were, nor are torpedoes, because they haven't been able to maintain their technological advantage in torpedoes, nor is it their most favoured weapon anymore, because A, it's expensive, and B, they're not as cutting edge as they would otherwise have been. Now, it does also have a pair of heavy disruptor cannons just sort of in the wings, as was pretty typical. Most captains got shot of these pretty quickly, for reasons that I will explain. In terms of its propulsion, it has 3 impulse units. Again, we'll see this kind of setup in future ships as well, but it is again an improvement over the Ktinga. Now, an interesting change to the engines, as well as the Bussard collectors, there's also a negative space cut out at the back, very reminiscent of 22nd century Klingon ships. These are effectively radiation vents. This allows the nacelle to safely vent radiation away from the ship, which indicates that they're using a new kind of warp coil. Possibly this warp coil is more powerful than the previous generation that was in use on board the Ktingas, and this is why it generates more radiation, so they need this new nacelle design to better mitigate that increased radiation level. So again, we've got a new nacelle and a new coil design. What we have here, we have a lot of new technology, but it's being applied to a very old idea. They're taking all this new stuff that is on offer, but they are basically trying to create the D8 from 24th century technology, and that's really part of the problem. You see, in terms of its performance, it's got some good points, but ultimately not great. So, in terms of its matchups, matching against Excelsior, after the Treaty of Alliance, there were some joint exercises done between Starfleet and the Klingons, some war games, and one of the war games involved a Kamarag engaging a Excelsior. The Kamarag did alright, it acquitted itself reasonably well, but one thing that it struggled to do was use its heavy disruptors. The Klingon captain kept trying to close to use those heavy disruptors in his wings, and the Excelsior kept jinking away and then accelerating out of range for those weapons. So he quickly found that this weapon was not particularly useful, and he was more trading blows with his simulated torpedoes and dual mode disruptors. Those were more effective. If he just used his dual mode disruptors on sort of strafing runs, impulses, he was able to do a lot more damage with that than he was with just trying to use his heavy disruptor cannons. Now this also factored into the matchup against the Nova, which the Kamarag did fight actively. You see, the heavy disruptor cannons, very good, very powerful, but they required the Kamarag to commit to a line. And a Nova could often read this, and either he could see you coming from a long way off, and if he had time, he could turn into the flight path of the Kamarag, fire his plasma torpedoes and all of his prow weapons, and, well, the Kamarag would be eviscerated. Or indeed, the Romulan could just wait for the Kamarag to overshoot, turn around, torpedoes, bye-bye the boys. So the heavy disruptors were not particularly useful. By contrast, the disruptors, especially at that mid-range, were very effective, as were the burst-fire torpedoes. Yes, the Nova did out-torpedo the Kamarag. It had 12 launchers, as opposed to the Kamarag's 2. But the Kamarag had burst-fire launchers, and the Nova was a bit of an older ship, using single-shot launchers, so rate of fire was actually pretty commensurate in many respects. It was not the overwhelming advantage for the Nova that it thought it would be. But, you know, the Nova was still big, heavy, tough. And the Kamarag had to be very careful to kind of sit between, basically sit at medium range. Don't get too close, or you will get disrupted to death. And don't get too far away, because then you'll take all the torpedoes that the Nova can throw at you. So it had to sit in this very precarious medium range in a lot of engagements. Now, it did have an advantage in terms of cloaking technology. The Kamarag utilized a newer form of Klingon cloak, and it was actually able to hide from other cloaked ships pretty well. Now, in terms of its matchups against the ships that were coming out at the same time, i.e. Ambassador and Vamalak, did not stand a chance, did not have a hope in hell against those things. The Klingons weren't trying to match those ships. And they certainly didn't with the Kamarag. You can, blame the decision-making process, but, they kind of got what they ordered in that respect. Now, in terms of ships that it is actually quite good at, it's quite good against most forms of birds of prey. Most of the Romulan birds of prey, which, bear in mind, still make up a fair chunk of the Romulan fleet and are still regularly in use, yeah, the Kamarag has a very good matchup against those. But fundamentally, what it actually boils down to is Kamarag is kind of best when it's fighting other Klingons. Again, you've got to think about the context of the Kamarag. The Empire's pretty unstable, and people are sort of questioning the Chancellor's rule at this point in Klingon history. So the Chancellor needs a big stick, and when most of your great houses are only armed with Ktingas and birds of prey, a Kamarag actually offers you quite a decisive advantage, and in that respect, it served as a good means of stabilizing the Empire. So, just to round off, in terms of does the Kamarag deserve the reputation which I've given it? There's a grain of truth. There's a grain of a very painful truth there, but it's more a product of its time. Any starship is going to be better than none, and given that the choice the Klingons had was to make a starship or not make a starship, and this was the best they could do, it's the best they could do, and, I'd rather have a Kamarag than nothing. And it did actually take some very important evolutionary steps in Klingon technology. They were misapplied. They had a kind of misunderstanding of how those technologies should be incorporated into a ship, but they were thinking about it, and they were working on them. And they got experience with them, and they learned from where they went wrong with the Kamarag. So arguably, the Votcha, which is an excellent ship, owes its success to the Kamarag. And yeah, fundamentally, when it comes down to it, when there's Romulan warbirds about to obliterate your border colony, you'd rather have a Kamarag than nothing. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please leave your comments below. And I will now thank my members. My Navarks, David Reeves, Tully DT, and Jeffrey Ballard. My Commanders, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Gilmo Martinez, Das Bluss, and Adam Bowman. And I thank my loyal Centurions, Nathaniel Mead, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Paul Lash, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, and Orcolcatum Questo. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.